Iran killed an American contractor, wounding many. We strongly responded and always will. Now Iran is orchestrating an attack on the U.S. embassy in Iraq. We will hold them responsible. In addition, we expect Iraq to use all its forces to protect the embassy and so notified. Joining us now to talk more about the implications of the attack are Michael Zanto, foreign policy analyst. Thank you for joining us, Michael. Also with us tonight, retired Army Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis, a senior fellow at Defense Priorities. Gentlemen, let's get started. This has been contained now. We just saw a tweet a few moments ago from John Bolton saying this is straight out of the Iranian playbook. Lieutenant Colonel Davis, first to you. Do you think this will continue to be a problem? Is this just a isolated incident, or will we see more of this in the coming days?
Without question, this is going to be a lot more of this. And I've been arguing literally since the middle of 2018 that we need to withdraw our forces for precisely this reason. They don't do anything for our national security, but they do have a target on their back at all times. And especially in this case right here, you just had the leader of the KH faction in there unambiguously say that we're going to attack even more Americans throughout the region right now. So now that we're at even more risk and even a greater reason why we need to pull them out.
Michael, this is one of the most secure areas of Baghdad. How did this even happen in the first place?
I mean, that's a very good question. So we're going to have to reassess our security measures and see if our Iraqi partners are doing what they should be to protect our embassy and other embassies for that matter.
So, we're looking at this now. This renews concerns about Iran's intended influence in the region. We've seen this before. Iran, it has their proxies. It's a Shia-dominated country, despite the fact that it was in Sunni control for so long under Saddam Hussein. But, since the invasion in 2003, the Shia majority in Iraq has had a lot of influence from Iran over them. We also saw, Lieutenant Colonel, some protests against the Iranians in Iraq. What is the level of, you said there's a strong anti-American sentiment. You think it's time for the U.S. just to pack it up and close the embassy and, close the embassy?
We don't have to close the embassy. I mean, that's a diplomatic front, but we do need to get our military out of there. Because what people aren't even asking the right questions right now, which is, why are American military forces still in Iraq? Why are they in Syria right now? And there obviously is no actual answer. They're not doing anything that's going to help the United States. You can't even say they're going after ISIS anymore, because from that base in Kirkuk, where the rocket attack first happened on the 27th, which spawned all of this mess, they're just kind of going through military operations and patrols and other kinds of training events, which have nothing to do with any of that. So it's time to ask, why are our troops there? And if there's no good answer, and there's not, then it is time to pack up the military and bring them home so that they can no longer be a pointless target in the Middle East.
I'm going to run through some reaction here real quickly. This coming from Florida Senator Marco Rubio, Foreign Relations Committee. Quote, an argument from Iraqi government and some in the U.S. that we brought embassy attack on ourselves by striking Iran's proxies is garbage. They've been firing at us for weeks and killed an American. We should just let them continue without responding in only language these people understand. Michael, what is the appropriate response, other than what we've seen from President Trump so far? What is the appropriate response to the Iraqi government here?
Well, I mean, it's hard. We're trying to make the Iraqi government stronger so it is able to resist Iranian influence and efforts to destabilize the region, which has been going on for 30 years, since the Iranian Revolution in 1979. I mean, these provocations are not new. Mm-hmm. The suicide bombings in Israel in the 90s and last decade were all basically sponsored by Iran. So Iran has been the lead sponsor of terror. They're responsible for the deaths of many, many Americans over a decade now in Iraq, sometimes in Afghanistan. They truck bombed our Marines in Lebanon in the early 80s with Lebanese Hezbollah. Hezbollah in Lebanon is just an extension of Iranian terrorism. So we cannot show weakness against this Iranian terror regime. So I don't know if pulling out completely is the answer. And by the way, remember when we pulled out forces from Syria, look what happened to our Kurdish allies. We allowed them to be vulnerable to this Islamist thug in Turkey, Erdogan. So we cannot abandon our allies. We cannot appear weak. But I don't totally agree that sometimes our forces on the ground are also targets. So I think we have to be strategic and careful. So, but I think that we just saw just a few months ago a pullout that had disastrous results. that only strengthened Iranian and Russian influence in Syria. So we can't just blindly pull out. We're going to hand over control of the whole region to a certain extent to Russia and Iran if we just pull out blindly. We can't do that.
Let's let Lieutenant Colonel Davis respond to that.
Yeah, I couldn't disagree more strongly with that, because our presence there right now does not do anything. I can tell you for a fact, because I've done these operations, a handful of troops isolated in the middle of Syria like those are, and these other troops in Iraq, they don't provide any kind of a benefit to the United States. They don't. Many people think that they do. Russia has been in Syria for decades. There's nothing new there. There's no vacuum to create by our withdrawal. All we do is put targets on our backs, but it doesn't provide any value or benefit for the United States. And we never actually pulled out of Syria. All we did is reposition forces from one place to another, which gave a free hand to Turkey. But it did nothing to cause any, quote, vacuum that created there. And we never left. And we kind of
hear about the opposite, too, even a little more mission creep, because despite the pullout that we heard about from Syria, we see more troops being sent to Saudi Arabia.
Well,
what happened to the Kurds? Look at what happened to the Kurds, our Kurdish allies.
We added an oil field defense mission to the Syrian mission and put more armor in there. We didn't pull out of anything. We actually added, and that's all a net negative for our country.
Michael,
By the way, it's very misleading to claim that the Russians have been in Syria for decades. Their base in Syria up until 2015 was completely symbolic. It had no function. And then suddenly there was this unprecedented Russian intervention that was bordering on an act of war against the United States in 2015, where their planes showed up trying to oppose American interest in Syria. Bashar Assad is also behind suicide bombings targeting Israelis and Americans. The Russian presence in Syria was just a symbolic issue until 2015. And then Putin moved in because he could. And then he fired cruise missiles from the Caspian Sea. And a month later, he said, notice they can carry nuclear weapons. He hopes he doesn't have to use nuclear weapons against Russia's enemies. So this is unprecedented aggressiveness by the Russians. It is nothing like we've seen since the fall of the Soviet Union. And we didn't see this under Gorbachev either. A lot of what we're seeing the Russians doing, we haven't seen since the late 70s, a very aggressive Russia. So to say that they've been in the region for decades is misleading.
The reason they did anything in 2015 is because we sent troops back into Syria in 2014, and they went in to help Bashar al-Assad. Of course, they're not going to be doing things before that militarily because there was no civil war. They didn't want to get involved with it, but they did when we went over there. Moreover, they have had a Al-Tanf base and a warm water port, which that's what they want to defend more than anything. They want to keep Bashar al-Assad in power. So the only reason you haven't seen it before is because there hasn't been the circumstances for it.
Right.
But there are.
Both Iran and Russia have shown that they want to keep Bashar al-Assad in power. So how do we keep? You see Iraq, of course, anyone can look at a map and see Iraq is right in the middle of Saudi Arabia and Iran. This is what's at stake here, and all the blood, sweat, and tears that have the U.S. and treasure that's been poured into Iraq over the last, 16 years. So, Lieutenant Colonel, what is the way that we prevent Iran from these types of provocative actions? We know they have, with the Saudi Arabian oil attack that they have, there are other provocations in the Gulf there with the other oil tankers, British ships. We've seen this as well. We've seen the maximum pressure campaign with the sanctions on Iran. What else can be done, not only to slow Iran down, prevent them from doing this, send a message that we will not tolerate this, but also prevent this new axis of evil from forming between Russia, Syria, and Iran?
Well, here's what has to happen. You have to look at this thing in context and not just at the surface level of what's happening right now, because this maximum pressure campaign is doing nothing but choking Iran to death and pushing them into increasingly desperate situations. And that doesn't help our case here. Iran poses no threat to the United States that we can't handle with our normal military posture, because consider this. Iran is a middling power in its own region, and they're more than balanced out by Saudi Arabia and Israel by themselves, not to mention other regional states.
But just to jump in there, I mean, we've been seeing this proxy war with Saudi Arabia and Yemen, and we've been supplying the Saudis with weapons. We've been unable to help them, really make any kind of ground in their proxy war against Iran. I wonder if they really have the support they need.
Well, but they don't need to be into a war with, if they're doing something with Iran, that's on them. That's not something that we need to support and that we need to help them win. They need to balance each other out, and that's the case right now. For our interests, we don't need to be involved in anybody's proxy war.
And that is one of the campaign promises that President Trump made, and, in a way, President Obama made too. Michael, that is one of the things he's up against now. This also got a little political today. Lindsey Graham tweeted this in response to everything. Very proud of President Trump acting decisively in the face of threats to our embassy in Baghdad. He has put the world on notice. There will be no Benghazis on his watch. Michael, obviously throwing a little shade there at the Obama administration for what happened during Benghazi. Do you think that's the case? Do you think do you see the parallels there, or I guess the lack of parallels here with what Lindsey Graham is saying?
I think that there were times clearly where the Obama administration were a little bit weak against Iran. I wouldn't list Benghazi, which was tragic and not, a highlight clearly either, but, an unnecessarily weak Iran deal, ignoring what appeared to be a attempted, thank God it failed, murderous terrorist attack again in D.C. to assassinate the Saudi ambassador, apparently, by a bombing in D.C., which appears to still have been orchestrated by some sort of elements. And like I said, 30 years of Iranian attacks against American interests and Israeli interests. But I wanted just to give a little bit of a historical background on the importance of the U.S. presence in the Persian Gulf. 1980, as President Jimmy Carter's leaving office, surprisingly, because he didn't have a reputation as a hawk, he issued what's called the Carter Doctrine, that we would defend our Persian Gulf allies against the Soviets, the Russians. And then what became known as the Reagan Doctrine, the Reagan corollary to the Carter Doctrine, was that we would defend Kuwait and Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates and other Gulf Arab states against the Iranians. And there was a moment in the Iran-Iraq war where President Reagan basically destroyed the whole Iranian Navy in response to their mining of the Persian Gulf. And of course, we fought Desert Storm, which was a great war after Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait and appeared to threaten Saudi Arabia. So the United States, like throughout the world, and that's why the world is in many ways still more peaceful than ever before, has been the guarantor of order. And so it is decades of U.S. foreign policy to defend countries like Saudi Arabia against aggressive terrorist states like Iran and Russia.
I think when you look at that, though, and again, this is what President Trump ran on. The foreign policy of the 1980s and the 1970s isn't the same foreign policy that we need today, right, Lieutenant Colonel?
Yeah, I'm all for that. That's frankly one of the reasons I voted for President Trump, was because of his stated foreign policy goals. And that's one of the key ones here. The Carter Doctrine made sense at the time, and the Reagan corollary, as your guest mentioned, that made sense at the time. It doesn't make sense now. Saudi Arabia spends $80 billion a year on their own defense. The oil from Saudi Arabia is far less important to us today because of our own oil production, which is dramatically higher than it was at the time. So we don't need to defend other nations, and we don't have any kind of treaty obligations to that effect. What we need is for American interests to be taken care of, and we don't need to have troops in Iraq that are there to defend Baghdad, which is pretty much what they are right now, or in Syria for any other reason. We got to defend our own interests, and that's what can be done outside with no boots on the ground in the Middle East.
Going back to President Trump's tweet that happened around 4:30 this afternoon, I mentioned this earlier, but here's the full thing. Quote, here's what the president says. The U.S. Embassy in Iraq is and has been for hours safe. Many of our great warfighters, together with the most lethal military equipment in the world, was immediately rushed to the site. Thank you to the president and the prime minister of Iraq for their rapid response upon request. Iran will be held fully responsible for lives lost or damage incurred and at any of our facilities. They will pay a very big price. This is not a warning. This is a threat. Happy New Year. Just with about a minute and a half left, guys, real quickly, this is not a threat. This is not a warning, rather. This is a threat. What do you think President Trump's next step is? First to you, Lieutenant Colonel.
Well, I certainly hope it's not to follow up with any kind of lethal operations, because the absolute worst thing that we could have right now is to escalate this beyond what it has been and to engage in a direct conflict with Iran, because no matter what anybody thinks, that would be catastrophic for our own interests.
Right. This is not Benghazi. This is not the fall of Saigon. Michael, last word to you.
We cannot let the Iranians get away with aggression. Look at the murders in Tel Aviv in the 90s, last decade. Look at the murder of our Marines in the 80s, or the murder of our troops in Iraq by Iranian-backed terrorists. We can't let them attack our embassy and attack our interests. That's not what the United States stands for. We have to be strong. I agree with President Trump on his tweet entirely.
Those sanctions are crushing the Iranian economy, and this is no doubt a reaction to what's happening to the regime under the pressure of the failing economy there. They're trying to goad the U.S. into conflict, and I don't know what's going to come of it. We will see. But thank you guys for your insight. Great information tonight. Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis and Michael Zanto, foreign policy expert. We appreciate it, guys. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks very much.
All right. Well, it has been